Guys, I'll get cookies.
Can we get some cookies for Kathleen?
If you don't mind. Oh, great. This looks great. Yeah, or do you have coffee? Yeah, no, just black. Come on. I guess I have to have a fork so I don't. It's such a mess. Yeah, I asked for some coffee. This is a treat.
Let me just start by welcoming everybody to a very special Night Media and Religion Forum with a guest that many of you know, and anybody who was lucky enough to be at the wonderful Ed Guthman tribute that we had a couple of weeks ago. You got to see her on tape, but now you get to see her for real. Kathleen Kennedy Townsend, who was Lieutenant Governor of Maryland. Many of us wish she had become the governor of Maryland.
Me too.
Has been devoted her life to public service and has now written a book called Failing America's Faithful. And she's going to be in dialogue in a moment with Diane Winston. But Kathleen, it's so wonderful to have you here. Your family has meant so much to so many of us for so many years. Of course, this year was also a year in which there was another movie that dealt with your dad. And as we were walking around outside looking at David Hume Kennelly's picture, we saw a picture of your father. People look out in these pictures out there. There's a wonderful Bobby Kennedy picture out there taken in 1966. At first, Kathleen said, what was he doing in Oregon in 1966? And then you figured out he was...
I was in ski camp, so it's probably... And then we went hiking with Justice Douglas afterwards. That was fun.
So please join me in welcoming Kathleen.
Thank you very much.
There's a book signing afterward, and it's terrific to have this discussion moderated by Diane Winston, who of course is our chair of media and religion, and the first such chair anywhere in the country, and doing a great job. So Diane, take it away.
Well, there are few people who are as well positioned to critique America's churches and her political institutions as our guest, Kathleen Kennedy Townsend. Kathleen Kennedy Townsend has been the assistant attorney, was Maryland's first lieutenant governor, and before that she was deputy assistant attorney general of the United States. Not only that, she comes, as you all know, from one of America's most foremost Catholic and political families. In 1960, her uncle gave a speech to the Houston Ministerial Association where he basically told the Protestant ministers who were very dubious of the Catholic running for president that he was not the Catholic candidate for president. He was the presidential candidate who was Catholic. Now, a lot has changed in the last 47 years, and I'm not quite sure we have the same equations in religion and politics anymore. And Kathleen is here today to talk to us about some of that, as well as her new book, Failing America's Faithful. She was just in my class where she had a wonderful give and take with her students, and I'm hoping today she might start off by telling us a little bit about how she came to write this book, and then maybe we could open it up for discussion.
Thank you so much. Oh, I see a number of your students here, and I had a great class. You have a great class, so thank you for letting me be part of it. I want to just acknowledge one of my great heroes, Ed Guthman, who is here with us today. Ed, as many of you know, worked in the Justice Department with my father and was really part of, I think, the best Justice Department we ever had in our country. And it was made, I think my father was a great Attorney General because he said, who are the best people in the country? And he got Ed Guthman to come. And he knew Ed because Ed had written groundbreaking and courageous stories about corruption in the Teamsters Union. And we could get into how you got involved.
It was really about Dave Beck.
It was Dave Beck? Yeah. And so it's really good to see you. And took on corruption and took, which for many of you don't remember, that the head of the FBI at that time was J. Edgar Hoover, who was saying, there is no such thing in this country as organized crime. And Ed Guthman and Bob Kennedy enlightened the head of the FBI. So that's great. And it's also great to be here with Jeff Cowan, who has been a friend for many years. And I think about 25 years ago helped to put on the Robert Kennedy remembrance, and I really appreciate that, because I think what my father had to say about what we should do in our country and about what justice means and what human responsibility means made a huge difference. Let me just, because we're talking about my father and the fact that there was a film, I will talk about why I wrote this book a little bit in context of my own family. There's one other person I want to mention. Ben Barber's been a friend of mine for 25 years, where we used to get involved in community service together, and he's moved on to the world, but it's good to see you here. You know, what I learned from my family, I grew up in a very Catholic family, was that we had a great big God who cared about justice, and that he really connected our faith to public life, to the common good, and to an argument that we should be on earth to make life better for others. And it was a faith that understood love on one hand, and I will talk about that in a minute, but because Ed Guthman is here, it's also a faith that understood that life could be tough. We definitely prayed a lot. You know, we went to, the class heard me tell this, we went to, you know, Sunday Mass, but my mother thought we should go to daily Mass, so in the summer we got up at 7 o'clock in the morning. All the kids in the school, and every night we prayed, you know, said the rosary, and my father actually used to read to us the Bible. When I told my grandmother that my father read the Bible to us, she said, "Really? Catholics don't read the Bible." And in fact, my mother and my Aunt Jean Kennedy Smith, my father's sister, said not only didn't we read the Bible, we were prohibited from reading the Bible. Very different religious tradition. We prayed often to St. Anthony to find parking spaces. We still do. Just the other week, I was with my mother in Washington, and we were on Connecticut Avenue, and St. Anthony got us a parking space right in front of Neiman Marcus. There was also an understanding that life was tough. We prayed for the souls of in the Soviet Union who were under communist domination. And when I was like in 3rd and 4th grade, when my father was working with Ed on prosecution of the Teamsters threatened to throw acid in my eyes. And they wanted to threaten my father. And so when all the other kids could leave elementary school, Our Lady of Victory, I had to sit up in the principal's office till I saw my mother drive up so we could get in the car. So my faith was always an understanding that you were on earth and there were going to be tough times, and that you had to gird yourself to deal with those tough times, but you still had to fight to do what's right, even at personal risk. It was also the time that you mentioned when there was a lot of anti-Catholic prejudice in the country. A little-known fact, but kind of interesting to me, is that when my uncle John Kennedy was running for president, Hubert Humphrey ran against him in the West Virginia primary. And the song, his campaign song, was "Give Me That Old-Time Religion." So he was interesting about Hubert Humphrey. A little-known fact, but I thought I'd remind you of all of that. And in fact, in the election returns, he did make that speech at Houston in which he said, "I hope the moment I was baptized didn't prohibit me from ever running for president. It certainly didn't prohibit me from fighting in World War II, from being wounded, from getting the Navy medal, and it didn't prevent my brother from dying when he was killed in World War II, so it shouldn't prevent us from becoming president." But despite that, and despite the fact that the largest single use of money in that 1960 campaign was to get that speech out to people across the country, only 35% of white Protestants voted for John Kennedy for president. He won with Catholic votes, with Jewish votes, and with African American votes. And that's, you know, there's still, and that has been a big division for a long time between Catholics and Protestants, white Protestants. But that's changing. He would. Thank you, Ed. Ed is filled with hope. I think that's true. I think he did that, and he was able to use religion in a way that brought people together. He mentions a great deal in his inaugural address on God's work. On this earth, God's work must truly be our own. He talked about how we have to fight for justice and quoting Isaiah, unburden the burdens on the poor. And he talked about how we're going to deal with the great challenges that is of mankind: poverty, tyranny, war. And it all had a biblical cast to it, because he realized that in this country, we are very much a religious nation. 85% of Americans say they believe in God. 50% say they go to church every Sunday. Only 25% do. So you realize they don't always tell the truth. But moving right along. And so I wrote this book because I thought that a couple of things had happened. One, that the Christian right had hijacked religion, that the Catholic Church had allowed their fear of women to blind them to their social justice message, and that the Democratic Party had become also fearful of religion and too degrading of religion, too secular. And I thought, so I took on the Democratic Party, the Christian right, and the Catholic Church. Nobody in this room, however. And I did this because I think that that God has been shrunk over the last 40 years, that we had a great God who cared about justice, and now we have still incredible issues in our country: an unjust war, the torture of our own prisoners, not taking care of our soldiers. We have the greatest income inequality ever in our history. And for the first time in 33 years, more people are falling into poverty, a greater percentage. And I think religion, which calls us to justice, asks us, what are we doing for our fellow human being? I quote in the book, and I'll stop talking after this, a great question, and since I'm in journalism school, I will end with the journalist's question. When David Frost asked in 1968, had an interview with Ronald Reagan and with my father. And he asked both of them, what are we on earth for? So I want you all to just take a second and figure out how you would answer that question. You thought I performed the whole time? No, you have to do some thinking. So just think about how you would answer that question, what are we on earth for? And then I'll give you what their two answers were. They were not given as much time by David Frost as I'm giving you. No, I'm not looking for volunteers. No, don't worry, I won't do that to you. But I do think it's good to think about how you would answer the question. So Ronald Reagan answered the question that we're each here on earth for individual salvation. And my father, it's a longer answer, which I won't quote you, but it was basically individual salvation, individual freedom. And my father said, we're on earth to help somebody that we come across, those who are a little worse off than we are. And there you have a different philosophy and theology of life. Is it all for ourselves, which is really part of American culture, or is it to build a community with others? And I think my father saw the importance of building a community and working with others and caring about how the others are treated. And I think that's what we're missing today. I had this great conversation with Jeff earlier about where does courage come from? And I think courage is a communal virtue. And over the last 30 years, without a community, we don't have the courage to speak up against what our government has done or what is going on in our country. And you need people who you can trust, who you can work with, who will have your back if you want to stand up and do the right thing. And we now have an ideology which is the theology of only myself, personal relationship to God, and a capitalism structure that says only care about yourself. And I think it's devastating to our nation and devastating to the world. And I believe that faith and God created people, created communities, and what we have to do is recapture the theology and recapture the houses of worship. I actually usually say churches, and they say, well, what about houses of worship? So I said, I don't have any problem with the synagogues. They're doing a good job. But really one of our challenges is that Christianity has really been hijacked, and that's what I wanted to focus on.
Kathleen or Paul Schrade?
Paul Schrade, who we've talked about this. Remember, Paul? We talked about Cesar Chavez.
Yep.
And how he...
And you're heading down to that evangelical church.
Yeah. Oh, I was going to see Rick Warren.
Rick Warren,
Yeah.
Kathleen, maybe you could talk a little bit about what you think is a good relationship between religion and politics, and how churches would not fail America's faithful.
Well, I mean, I think that the reason I wrote this book is because 25 years ago I had written a number of articles criticizing the Democratic Party for losing religion, which I thought was a disaster, because I think it gives you I think throughout our history, as you've done in your history class, all the great progressive movements have had a religious base, from the abolitionists to the suffragette movements to the social gospel movement to the labor movement. I mean, Cesar Chavez is a great example, but in the 30s and 40s, the Jesuits had 300 labor organizing schools throughout the country. And I was just telling the class about how when I talked to John Sweeney, the president of the AFL-CIO, I was telling him about my book and about how interesting it was and how he has to read it. And that, did you know that the Jesuits had 300 labor organizing schools? I thought I was so proud to tell John Sweeney something, and he said, Kathleen, I went to one. And so he, and actually he went to the one that was organized and taught by the guy who was the priest on the waterfront. And I thought that the Democratic Party had blown it by losing faith, which they had. Now I wrote about the churches because I think the churches have so hijacked faith that they have shrunken God, focused on those three issues: abortion, same-sex marriage, and stem cell research, and just lost the whole range of issues that we should be focused on. And I wanted to argue, and do argue, that the churches have lost their core mission, and that I wanted to make sure, in the way that many of you probably study Islam today, so you understand what's going on in Islam, we should understand what our Judeo-Christian tradition really teaches, rather than allow the Christian coalition to say they're Christian, when in fact what they teach is about as anti-Christian as you could find. And so we have to challenge them on their theological grounds, not just say, as too often is said, get religion out of politics. I think that faith gives us the energy to fight for justice, as it did for Cesar Chavez. I don't think you need churches, government to allow money to be used for proselytizing, but you can certainly work with churches for social justice, and I think we've done that in our history. We've used, certainly through the labor organizing, through Catholic charities, associated Jewish charities, but it's also, in this country at least, we are faith-based people, and our faith should call us to care for something more than ourselves, and to build that community that gives us the courage to do just that.
Judy, what do you say to those Americans who really are worried about the separation of church and state being eroded, and who say they are spiritual but not religious? Sam Harris, for instance, who's often labeled an atheist, who came and talked to our class, describes himself as spiritual and ethical, and finds that organized religion has become dangerous.
Right. Well, I say I've talked to Daniel Dennett, who's written about how he's an atheist, and that his studies of atheists have shown that atheists have better marriages, give more to charity, and are happier than believers. So that may be true, but they don't organize. They're not in communities. And people can be very spiritual, but again, they're not in a community. And churches are political players in this country. The Catholic Church is a political player. And to retreat from that is a retreat from what should be done. I talked to your class, they didn't know much about him, but I really go back to Saul Alinsky. Some of you have studied Saul Alinsky. He looked at how you organize in poor communities, for instance. He said the only community, aside from Paul Schrade and the auto workers who I love, and the know, the farm workers, the unions, which we used to be 30% of our workforce, are down to less than 10% now. There's no other institution that has a way to bring people together. So by saying you don't like religion, change it. Get it to improve. I mean, you know, that's what Martin Luther did. And why can't we do the same? You can change your religious institutions. It's a power, but to give up on it is sort of, I think it's not as useful a tack to take.
Are you aligned then with Jim Wallace, who also believes that Christianites hijack Christian message?
Well, I'm aligned with anybody who thinks that. And I'm a big fan of Jim Wallace. In fact, in my book, he says it is a must-read book. So he's a plus. He's a line. Yeah, I think he's, yes.
I know the obvious reason, you know, not to be influenced by, you know, the conservative right is not to have any involvement other than the obvious. But I've noticed that religious affiliations have a strong influence on political matters, whereas political matters really don't have too strong of an influence on the religious agenda. In light of, you know, the controversies regarding, you know, the pedophilia and what have you, the long line of allegations against, you know, different churches and different leaders of the churches. What would you recommend to the average citizen, the average taxpayer, you know, to, I guess, would maybe remedy that situation, you know, an ongoing and almost like repeated offenses?
Well, if you're actually about the pedophilia scandal in the Catholic Church, what would is that your question? What
it's not just within the Catholic Church.
Well, a lot of it's in the Catholic Church. I mean, well, I think that first of all, they are under investigation. I think you have to speak about how terrible the bishops behaved throughout this crisis. They were not forthcoming, they were not forthright, and they've suffered because of it. So I think that's been helpful. The number of, they've been under investigation, and I think that's been good. I think they've revealed themselves as more self-interested in preserving their power than in helping the people of the church and the children that came into their care. So I think that's been sad and unfortunate, but true. So it's good to know what kind of institution we're often dealing with. Do you want me to talk about what I think you could do as a Catholic in the Catholic Church?
No, I know what to do as a Catholic in the Catholic Church. No, I've been very active for the past 5 years.
Yeah.
So I've put my 2 cents in terms of what the infrastructure can do.
Right. Well, I would say, first of all, 2 cents is important. $1 is better. You know, and I don't mean money. I mean that there has to be energy to change the Catholic Church. When I talked to Cardinal McCarrick, who was the Cardinal in Washington, D.C., I asked him why he couldn't lead the reformation of the Catholic Church. He said, it never comes from the hierarchy. It has to come from the ground up. So it says to Catholics, you've got to work from the ground up. He also says that no progressive Catholics or liberal Catholics, or however you want to describe themselves, ever write Rome. They only hear from conservative Catholics. So I think progressive Catholics should start a letter-writing campaign. You see, our church is a very political church. You saw them change after the statements in Germany about Islam. You know, 6 weeks later, there he was in Turkey praying with the imam. And as Cardinal Ratzinger, he said we should never pray with people of a different faith. And he was praying 6 weeks later. So people can change. People are susceptible to political pressure. And use it. Yes?
I understand your argument about churches, that if you go back to what Christianity or Christianity, any religion really preaches, it's uprightness.
Right.
So churches should therefore be political. They should organize their communities to help poverty and other issues. But that's an argument for why churches should be political agents. What's the argument for why politicians take on the church? I mean, why can't
I don't make that argument. I only make the first part. I don't say politicians should control churches. I think that would be a really bad idea.
control,
What?
why do you think that politicians are, or to what extent should politicians be using religion in their,
When you say using, what do you mean?
well, I mean, talking about your uncle or your father, kind of huge politicians who are using religion as a way of organizing people and saying we need to help others and we need to, and I agree with the messages certainly of alleviating poverty, but isn't that politicians using religion as a way of, and progressive movements?
Well, I guess this is what we talked about in the class. I thought was helpful. The word religion covers a multitude of sins, and there. Somebody at least laughs. I mean, I thought it was kind of amusing myself. And there are different types of religion. There's exclusive religions that says I'm saved and you're not, and there are religions of the kind of, and then there's sort of a cultural Judeo-Christian tradition in this country that talks about it's much more inclusive. And that's what John Kennedy did in his inaugural address. It's what my father did when he talked about, suppose God is black. He didn't say, God is Methodist or God is Catholic, or, it wasn't, or God is Jewish. It wasn't divisive. And so I think rather than talk only about the broad category of religion and what religion should do, it might be more helpful to understand what kind of religion, and are you being an exclusive hijacking of religion? Are you misusing your the faith? And that's what I'm getting to. We have this discussion very easily with Islam, I think, which is people argue, well, is Islam a religion of violence? And people would say, no, it's not. It's been mischaracterized. But we don't use that same discussion when we talk about Christianity, for example. And I think what I hope is that we'll start to talk about it so it's a much more rich kind of discussion. Yeah.
First, I just want to say that I actually worked as a legislative aide during the 2000 session in Maryland.
Ah.
So I
You remember those great days.
I was out of the country for your campaign. I couldn't work on your campaign. I could work on Paris Clendening's re-election campaign.
Good. Thank you.
I'm listening to this, and it's very, it's crucial, but what concerns me is maybe the dilution, where it's like, well, it's almost, and again, I'm not a religious person. I'll just say it straight up. I'm born Jewish, but I'm not religious at all. But it seems to me like what's happening is either you have, there's one God, and this is the rules, and if you try to change it, then, how can you change the absolute truth of the Word of God? Now, the other side, you're saying, well, we're all sort of on this together. Doesn't that almost, at the same time, does that sort of dilute sort of the religious lines? I mean, there's a reason the Pope is Catholic, right? He's not.
He doesn't have to be. Well, I'm going to tell you a story about my father. It's not quite relevant, but it's still an interesting story. My father was very religious. He was an altar boy all the time. He wanted to become a priest. In fact, when he met my mother, who wanted to become a nun, he said to my Aunt Jean, who introduced them, "How can I compete with God?" I just laid the groundwork for this story. So when he was at Harvard, he went to the Newman Center, which is, do you have a Newman Center on USC campus? Some of you may know. It's sort of the Catholic center. And he was very devout, and he went to church, and he went to the Newman Center. And at the Newman Center, there was a man named Father Feeney. And Father Feeney started to preach that only Catholics could be saved. And my father said that couldn't be true. That's not a kind of God that we would believe in. What kind of God would create a world in which only one particular group could be saved? It wouldn't be a just God. It wouldn't be a loving God. It makes no sense. And so we argued with Father Feeney. And my grandmother was horrified because my grandmother grew up in a church in which you never disagree with the priest. My father said, no, you have to, that was wrong. And so we stopped going to the Newman Center. And a few years later, Father Feeney was excommunicated because that is not the teaching of the church. And so this idea that you have to be only yourself, you know, only part of a single church, and you can't embrace other churches, it's not really the teaching, at least of my faith. And I don't think it's really a teaching of a Christian teaching, of a God. What kind of God would say you only have to believe a certain faith? But it does teach us that we have to open ourselves up to others. I hope you like that story. Thank you.
How do you feel about someone like Barack Obama, who is embracing religion as a member of the Democratic Party, but then sort of saying, you know, if God didn't choose Republicans and Democrats, it's okay for us to be religious? Do you think that's a positive? Well,
You don't think he chose Democrats? That's actually somebody asked me the other day. She didn't choose Democrats. Actually, somebody did call in a radio talk show. Do you think a Republican could be Christian? Well, I think that's a good message. I mean, that's obviously the message that we should all understand, that we're, you know, as Lincoln said, the North and the South prayed to the same God and read to the same Bible. So, which is really a wonderful message, that we shouldn't degrade or diss anybody who is of a different faith or a different political party. And I think it's a really wonderful message, because today our country has become so divided. It's actually coming together now against George Bush, but which is one value. But for a long time it was really divided, and people of different parties didn't talk with one another, and people would, if you were part of an evangelical religion, you really didn't think you should hang out with somebody who was secular, and vice versa. I mean, I've had dinner, when I was talking to people about writing my book, the viciousness with which I heard described religious people was stunning to me. So I think there's really a great divisiveness, and I think Barack is very smart to say, and wise and helpful to say we should all work.
Do you think you can appeal to those members of the Democratic Party who see religion as a negative?
I think he can, because I don't know, those conversations that I had that were so vicious against religion have stopped. And that might be because I don't go to those dinner parties. But it'd also be that Barack has that ability to reach people. And, yeah, so that might be, yeah.
In class, and a couple minutes ago, you mentioned Solinsky, and my sense of your appreciation for him is that as an advocate for social change, he didn't promote the idea that movements for social change should be organized around a single issue.
That's right. That's very.
Sort of organized around
that's right. That's right.
But recent history suggests that the religious right and their political allies have been successful by organizing mass movements around the issues you mentioned, gay rights, so on and so forth. And
Oh, no. Go ahead.
Let me finish my question.
Yeah.
Tell me why I'm wrong.
Yeah.
My sense is, and my question for you is,
Yeah.
if that's the case, is it possible for a religious left or people on the religious left in the U.S. to organize a mass movement without specific issues to crystallize the movement around, or without a central charismatic figure or figures around?
Let's just go back to the Solinsky argument. The argument was organize groups of people who are in a group, and then you can take on particular issues, which is what the Christian right did. They organized in the churches. One day it'll be stem cell research, another day it'll be abortion, a third time it might be, what is it? Cloning. In other words, it's always the same people. The issues change. Unlike the left, the unions were good at that. I mean, very frankly, the union movement was, because they were together as a union, they're basically, if you're in politics, the one group that talks about issues that aren't particularly interesting to them. you can get unions to be interested in the minimum wage, where in fact most of them all get paid above the minimum wage. You can get them interested in national health care, although for them, they already have health care. You can get them interested in some environmental issues, more difficult often, but they are a group, so you can keep going back to the same well on different issues. Unlike an environmental group, who it's always an environmental issue. They're not going to get interested in a feminist issue, or a feminist group won't get interested in a union issue. So what the right figured out is, where are the people? And we'll shape the issues, but we'll always have them with us. And that's the value of organizing the churches, or the value of organizing in unions, or if you could figure out a different way. But we need a community. Because if you go back to that point I made later about courage, if you don't have a community, you don't have anybody at your back, and therefore you don't have the courage to stand up when things are tough. And you really got to have that kind of courage. Thank you. So I don't see it other than, I mean, I think the unions do it, and I think the churches can do it. I don't see other communal groups. But Ben has written about this. Maybe you see others, Ben.
change things all the time, you know, are the radicals right now. So I think that language, and I think we need to get away from that language. You and I were talking before, and just to emphasize somebody's question about religion entering the political arena in a dangerous way. One of the things Democrats have done is pretend that religion is private, not public. I think you write about this in your new book, but religion is public. It's public. And the idea that it's a privatized thing between you and your God, and you choose your God the way you choose your living room color. You've got a private preference, and that's all there is to it. It's an absurd way to think about religion. I think Democrats have gotten afraid not of religion, but of public religion.
Yeah.
Religion is public, and until we recognize that, in fact, Democrats are going to have a very large problem with it. So I think.
Yeah.
I think
Right. No, I say, you know, we've shrunk God, and it's only me and God. I mean, it's just horrendous. We need public spaces, and that's what Democrats are supposed to be caring about, and yet they've allowed our theology, which is so much part of our consciousness, to be shrunk. Yes?
Yeah, I actually studied with your husband at St. John's. It's really nice to meet you.
Oh, God, thank you. That's so wonderful.
My question is this. I've been thinking about some of the names you've mentioned, like Martin Luther King Jr. and others, people from back in the abolitionist period who injected their religion into public life in some way. I'm just wondering if we take these people really seriously, if what they're doing is in fact perhaps too subversive and too radical for any of the political parties. You know, I'm thinking about like Martin Luther King Jr.'s speeches and sermons, not on civil rights, but on the Vietnam War. He really called into question, you know, the whole American system, you might say.
Right.
Or I think William Lloyd Garrison even at one point burning the U.S. Constitution out of public
Right.
rally. I'm just wondering, I mean, what you're saying really resonates with me, but I'm wondering if in a sort of authentically Christian voice in the public square would be so radical, it would be absolutely intolerable to both the left and the right within the sort of acceptable political framework we have.
It's a really great question. So I'll tell you a story. Of course. In 1960, Martin Luther King was jailed by, it was picked up for, I think, a parking ticket in Georgia. And a judge sentenced him, because he was on probation for a civil rights violation, he sentenced him to, I think, 3 months hard labor for a parking ticket. And this was outrageous in the, sort of October in 1960. And my, because of Harris Wofford, who some of you may know, he got John Kennedy to call Martin Luther King's wife, Coretta Scott King, and say, I'm very sorry. And Coretta was very moved. And my father originally said, well, you shouldn't have gotten involved in this issue. Then slept on it, and the next day said, this is outrageous. 3 months hard labor for a parking ticket. So my father called the judge, more effective, and got Martin Luther King released. And then, so somebody in the campaign said, well, now will you endorse John Kennedy for president? And Martin Luther King said, no, just because the morally right is sometimes the politically expedient is not the reason I'm going to endorse John Kennedy. So, just so you're right about that. But his father, Daddy King, who had the church, said, I'll vote for a Catholic or the devil himself. If he wipes the tears from my daughter's eyes, I've got a church full of votes for Senator Kennedy. Well, don't you think it's funny that he was prejudiced against Catholics? But the point you raise, it's a funny story about Martin Luther King's father. But what is right about what you say is there is always, if you get too faith-based, I mean too close to the Gospels, it's impossible. It's very impractical. It's what Ronald Niebuhr would say. You have to watch it. But so I think you raise a very good point. I don't think we're near there yet. And I think that there is a wisdom in the United States to understand. There's some wisdom and there's some non-wisdom. I think, Lloyd Garrison was very radical, that if you push faith too far, there's a reaction against it. The crucifixion is very true. Or people get tired of religion, which is what has happened in Europe because of the fanaticism that is sometimes tied. This is not, so you're right. Nonetheless, without deep faith, I mean, it's hard to do really difficult stuff. It's just hard to put yourself at risk. I mean, Europe, I think somebody asked, can you be an atheist and a good person? I think you could be an atheist and a good person. But, did somebody say that? Yeah. But I think Europe does not take risks. I mean, it's Americans that had to go into Bosnia. And it was right on Europe's door, and they didn't do anything. So I think, sometimes it's tough. And I don't have an easy answer, and that was a really good question. Yes?
I was curious regarding any opinions you had about Mormonism and a church that can maybe at one time have elements of exclusivity and at the same time have the opportunity to offer great charity and outreach, especially in impoverished nations. So.
Yeah, I'm not really interested in charity. I think a lot of churches do charity. But in my book, I have this chapter called, And Moses Didn't Have a Bake Sale. And the point is that we have to fight for justice as well as charity. And it's not enough just to, give. Charity just is lucky that I run into you today and you happen to run into me and I have some money I give you. I want a community that is just and that is fair to all its members and has, health care and fair labor laws and good education and public spaces. And you can't do that through charity. So I'm happy look, I'm not against charity, but I don't think that's a sufficient faith. I mean, I don't think that's sufficient. And that's why I think we really need voices that say, what kind of society do we have? Franklin Roosevelt would say that the New Deal is putting into practice the Sermon on the Mount. There's really a sense of we have to create a just society, not just individual charity. And we've lost that. We've lost it, and I'm sorry Ben left, because we used to talk about how a lot of volunteerism has descended into volunteerism rather than civic engagement. It's all private again. Charity is private, not public. And we need to create a morality of a public space. Was that helpful to you?
Yeah, and if you had any thoughts, because I think lots of times it escapes us, and it's obviously coming up now with Mitt Romney running, and
Yeah.
the role of Mormonism is,
Yeah.
it's, I think, mysterious to a lot of us who
Yeah.
With one wife.
Yeah, you know, and I think the problem with Mitt Romney is clearly that he's changed his position on so many issues, and I think that's his problem. You know, I'm not I think the conservatives don't really choose. I maybe proved wrong in this election, as I proved wrong in a number, but you know, in 1980, Jimmy Carter had been faithful to his wife, had admitted to having lust in his heart. It just reminds me, he was about as sincere a Christian as you could find, running against Ronald Reagan, who never went to church and was divorced twice. And the Christian right voted for Ronald Reagan. So I'm not sure if they really care about the individual faith of the person. I mean, they didn't choose Jimmy Carter, they chose Ronald Reagan. So I think there's something about they like the issues he stood for.
If I could just follow up on that.
Yeah.
A recent poll said that there were more than 30% of Americans said they could not vote for a Mormon president, which took me back to the John Kennedy days. Right?
Yeah.
The same kind of prejudice
Yeah.
existed against Catholics, and
Right.
today we would find that
Right.
quaint, and yet here we are with 30% of Americans admitting that they have a prejudice against this one religion to the point where they couldn't vote for somebody for president. Answering a poll honestly, when usually if you said, could you vote for a black president, they would say, oh yes, even if they didn't mean it. This is a prejudice that apparently is allowed to be.
Yeah, that's right.
So do you see any parallels there with your uncle? And do you think that would change? Mormonism, Islam, could we have Islam president?
You know, the least, can I just jump in? The faith group that's gets the highest negatives are atheists. People will vote for Muslims before they'll vote for atheists. So
Could we have an atheist for president?
probably not. Probably not in our lifetime. I'm sorry. I just think that's.
Yeah, there you go.
I'd like to see what actually happens when he runs. I mean, he won in Massachusetts. His father won in Michigan. I mean, Mormons have won in states that aren't Utah. It might be that they didn't know what a Mormon was. I don't know what the question, you know, I mean, to tell you the truth, I didn't think much about Mormons till recently. You know, in other words, it's not part of my consciousness, and it might be me that they really didn't know what they didn't know what it was. It could have been somebody from outer space.
To a lot of people, I think once they.
In other words, they didn't know that there was a Mitt Romney who was running. There's not a, Catholicism, there was hundreds of years, at least 150 years of sheer political campaigning against Catholics, the Know Nothing movement, the Ku Klux Klan, people running against people who were Catholic. It was a big part of our nation's history. That has not been a big part of our nation's history to run against Mormons. It's just not part of our
But they've been driven out of many communities to the point where.
They've been, many evangelical churches have disseminated anti-Mormon materials for the last 25 years. So there's been a very heavy educational campaign among evangelicals.
Oh, well, then you know better than I.
Against Mormons, and I think that's part of the problem. But can we have one more question, because it's almost time for book signing? Yeah?
I'm sorry, I just read on your classic session question because I missed the first part. So, given to the situation in the whole world, I'm more interested in those what's happening in those really poor countries like South Africa, like China. Because now I am also Christian. I go to church every week, but it's really hard for my parents to believe there is such a God who really cares about the whole world. Because in some countries, most of the people, they are still starving. It's really hard for them to believe that. How do you think about what we can play in such a campaign?
You mean, how can I tell somebody that they should believe in God?
Right.
Well, that's not what I'm going to do. I think that's a big question, and I'd have to understand their doubts. And I think that's a very tough question, to tell somebody why they should believe in God.
I've been thinking about it for a really, really long
No, it's a very, it's very tough. It comes out of my own, probably, faith, and it comes out of my belief that there is something about each of us that is spiritual, and that reacts to the spirituality and the goodness of other people that we should do, that we should try to reach out to. And it's my own sense of when I've been in great pain or in tough times that I've been able to pray, and that prayer has blessed me, and I felt that kind of blessing. But I think it's very tough to tell somebody who's seen the incredible justice in the world that there is a God. I think that's I think it's very tough. It's been helpful to me, but I understand your parents. Yeah. Thank you very much. Well, that was a very profound question at the end. But I want to thank you very much for having me. Thank you. Great. Thank you.
Thank you. I like going road.
It's fun, isn't it?
Really a pleasure.
Yeah, it's fun.
And I'll give Krista your contact information.
Okay, great.